Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. Our dedication to living life joyfully allows us to confront the reality of unmitigated deception and political denial of the harm caused by nuclear and chemical contamination. We demand an end to corporate control of science and suppression of facts for political and financial gain. We are not assets on a balance sheet. We must honestly work together to remediate damage to benefit our planet and humanity. Remember, happiness is resistance, and love is greater than fear. Join the Age of Fission radio show on Spreaker.com. Search for Lonnie Clark for all our podcasted shows. Podcasts are also on YouTube at nutzforart, NUTZFORART. Thank you for being part of the solution. Good afternoon. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to thank you for finding our radio show here on Spreaker or on KEPW.org. That's 97.3 FM in the Eugene and Springfield area here in Oregon. So if you're in Oregon and you're near our city, you can find us. Otherwise, you can find me on Spreaker. That's Spreaker, Spreaker.com. Just look for Lonnie Clark. I actually have 3 shows on my channel. I carry Nuclear Hot Seat, Operation Save the Earth, and my show Age of Fission. And we also are playing on live stream. They play us every Saturday on KEPW.org. My show also reflects out on my YouTube channel, which is Nuts for Art, NUTZFORART. So that out of the way, I want to thank you for joining us. And I'm very, very excited to have someone that I've interviewed before on my show. It's been quite a long time since I've been doing my own producing of my shows, Mr. Chuck Johnson. So, Chuck, thank you for joining us, and why don't you introduce yourself to our audience here?
Yes, it's great to be on your show again, Lonnie. For the last year and 2 months now, I have been the director of nuclear programs for International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which is an international organization founded in the 1980s by U.S. and Soviet doctors concerned about the threat during the height of the Cold War of nuclear annihilation, and winner of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to convince Gorbachev and Reagan that arms control was a much better alternative to making nuclear threats. So I've been working with this group now for about a year and 2 months, as I said. And prior to that, I was working for Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is its American affiliate. But actually, its precursor, it was founded in the 60s. So it's both the child and the parent. Ironically.
So what's the difference in the work between the two? Because don't they both work to stop nuclear weapons?
PSR was founded to stop nuclear weapons in the 60s and focused on nuclear weapons testing, above-ground nuclear weapons testing, which was a big issue that was ultimately successful when Kennedy and Khrushchev signed the above-ground nuclear testing ban. But PSR, when it was revived in the 70s by Dr. Helen Caldicott and a couple of other doctors, was focused initially more on nuclear power. And then as the Cold War heated up again, turned its attention to nuclear weapons again.
Okay.
And since that time, in the 90s, PSR branched out to working on issues of climate, handgun control, and a number of other things. The IPPNW, by contrast, has not branched out to climate issues, nor does it have a position officially as an international organization against nuclear power.
Wow.
And that's because we have some of our affiliates who are still favoring nuclear power, so that we don't have unanimity among them,
That's
which is unfortunate.
interesting.
Most of the really active people are opposed to nuclear energy, and some of our largest affiliates, like the German affiliate, has been extremely active in fighting nuclear power. But the Japanese affiliate is an example of an affiliate that still supports nuclear power even after Fukushima.
That's
They're
interesting.
tied to the Japanese Medical Association, and also which is tied to their government, which supports nuclear energy still. They personally don't support it, but they just don't want to take a position against nuclear power because, allegedly it would divert our attention or be controversial or something like that.
Blah blah blah.
So
Yeah.
we don't
How do
actually
people find your website? Why don't you give the
nuclear
website?
energy.
Why don't you give your website address so people can find out and go to your
It's
website?
www.ippnw.org. It's I, P as in Paul, P as in Paul, NW as in nuclear weapons.org. And there's quite a bit of information and links to the different affiliates that we have. A lot of information about the thing we've been most focusing on for the last decade, which is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that's the main thing that I've been working on since I started here in Boston with IPPNW.
Why don't you give us an update on what it is and what the status is? Because I think most people out in America, like I would have thought that myself before I heard about it, that the United States was signed on to that, but it's not.
Oh, no. Well, the United States signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, which has an Article 6 requirement that all of the nuclear weapon states that are identified in that treaty, there were 5 then, are required to be involved in good faith negotiations to eliminate nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, they have not followed through on that. There were some limitations put in during the 80s and 90s, and then most recently by President Obama with Vladimir Putin to further reduce the total number of nuclear weapons that the U.S. and Russia have, but they're capped at 1,600 warheads, active warheads at any given time, which is still enough to kill everyone on the planet. So many times over, mostly through, directly people would die, but an even larger number would die due to the dust clouds that would be raised by an all-out nuclear war, which would cause crop failure for decades if all of those weapons were used.
I mean, that could just be annihilation, just because would destroy our environment. I mean,
Right.
As it is, we're struggling to manage our environment as it is with all the nuclear waste and contamination that we've got already. I mean, that's the other thing people forget about nuclear is you're not just bringing nuclear contamination, you're bringing chemical contamination, because to deliver the nuclear weapons, you need a truckload of highly toxic chemicals also. So it's
the biggest danger in terms of mass death would be just particles of dust and dirt and soot, that get up in the atmosphere, sort of the opposite of global warming. It would be nuclear winter, which was hypothesized during the 80s by Carl Sagan and several others, and has been since further investigated and shown to be true. Our own organization put out a nuclear famine report in 2013 that, with assistance from Alan Robach at Rutgers University, determined that up to 2 billion people would be at risk of death from just the India and Pakistan conducting a partial nuclear war in which 100 warheads would be detonated. They each possess about 150 warheads currently, so that they have about 300. So this would only be a limited nuclear war between those two countries, would kick up a dust cloud that would affect crops enough for 20 years that 2 billion people could die from it.
I wouldn't say that that's limit. I mean, they call this limited war. That's the wordplay on nuclear, right? Because it's not, we're beyond that point of being limited when you're talking about 2 billion people. I mean, that's, you can't. So what is the gist of what you're working on? Like, what are you've been there about a year. I used to interview about, when I had my other show on UCY TV, I interviewed you probably every 6 weeks, and you were actively engaged with a PSR and various things really that really helped move the ball forward towards a more peaceful resolution. What are you doing now? What are the bulk of your activities going on now?
Well, it is this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. IPPNW 11 years ago co-founded in Australia with the local WILPF chapter, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, an organization called ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And the idea was to break outside of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which had bogged down and had become stale. You had the 5 nuclear weapon states that were in that treaty, weren't denuclearizing and weren't showing any signs of doing it. And then you had an additional 4 countries outside of it that either had developed nuclear weapons, had never joined the treaty, or had pulled out of the treaty. In the case of North Korea, I believe they had just begun testing their nuclear weapons about the time this treaty started. They weren't too far along, but they were already a nuclear weapons state, essentially, at that point. So you had 9. And a number of groups and individuals just felt that there needed to be a new, initially they were talking about having an international convention to set up a treaty that would ban nuclear weapons, just like chemical weapons have been banned, biological weapons have been banned as a class of weapons, as opposed to this limitation treaty that the NPT was. Like landmines had been banned, or like cluster munitions had been banned. And you don't have 100% observance of those treaties, but you're getting close in some of them. And when chemical weapons, for example, are used, the country that uses them basically tries to hide the fact that they did it and denies that they did it, and goes into contortions to try to tell others that they are not the pariah nation that others are calling them. So we'd like to have the stigmatization of nuclear weapons, which are, more horrible than even chemical or biological weapons. Why should they have this exalted position, and why should they not be a stigmatized weapon that the world is seeking to ban? So that, and no one has a really good answer to that one, particularly, other than just the status quo that we find ourselves in of mutually assured destruction, allegedly protecting us from getting involved in horrible wars. The fact that we have a weapon that that allegedly can't be used, that a lot of people believe can't be used, then it will deter people from actually getting into warfare that would lead to it. Of course, that relies on having rational actors as the heads of the nations that have these weapons. Right. And the last couple of years have really helped us, I believe, in showing the need for this new treaty.
It's the crazy factor. That's what I called it in my political science class, where my teacher said, "Oh, well, nuclear weapons keep us safe." I'm like, "Well, what about the crazy factor?" Well,
we definitely are facing that, and it's brought nuclear weapons issues back up in the public mind, where for a very long time people haven't thought about them. But internationally, the other countries that are not nuclear weapons states were very were willing to listen and interested in discussing, what might be a better approach to getting rid of them.
So do you interface with governments?
Well, just let me finish. There were a series of meetings. The first one in Norway, the second in Mexico, and the third in
Mm-hmm.
Austria, to discuss the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war and the need to establish this new treaty. And after the third one, they resolved, the countries that participated in it resolved to go to the UN and ask the UN to initiate a treaty itself, which they have the power to do.
Mm.
And they did. And it passed, surprisingly, with opposition from all the nuclear weapon states and a boycott from the United States and the other nuclear weapon states and many of the allies of those nuclear weapon states. So it passed on July 7th, 2017, by a vote of 122 to 1 with one abstention. And the one voting against it was the Netherlands, which is a U.S. ally, NATO ally, and the abstention was Singapore. A number of countries didn't participate in it. There are about 190 UN eligible states that could have participated. So from those numbers, you can tell that a number of the countries weren't there, but a majority were there and voted for it.
How did the U.S. vote?
The U.S. did not vote. The U.S. was not there. Nikki Haley, who was the U.S. ambassador at the time the treaty passed, organized a press conference outside of the meeting room where the treaty was being discussed with the French and British ambassadors, who were looking kind of sheepish, actually, at that event because it made them look weak. They spoke out against this treaty from the outside, and they look like they sort of look like us. We find ourselves outside of meetings protesting things. Well, here was the U.S. government and the nuclear weapon states outside of the meeting, UN meeting, protesting the meeting. It didn't look really forceful or strong that they were doing that, and did not deter anyone from voting for it, apparently. Well, I shouldn't say anyone. I think there were about 10 countries that ended up not going to the final meeting where the vote took place. So there was some influence in terms of intimidating countries and threatening countries. And now we're at the phase where, for this treaty to take effect, 50 countries have to sign and ratify it. And so we have been in the process. We have 63 affiliates around the world, and we're working through the ICANN network with over 500 organizations worldwide to help convince governments to follow through and sign the treaty, have their head of state sign the treaty, and then have their parliament or whatever procedure they have in their country to ratify the decision to take part in the treaty. Once we get to 50, then it officially becomes a UN international treaty that has regular meetings and sets policies of implementation. And so at that point, the countries that are not party to it become essentially international pariah nations that are not party to an international treaty, agreed upon international treaty. And at this point, we have 70 countries that have signed it and 22 that have ratified it. The most recent was South Africa, which was a really important one because of their influence in Africa, and particularly in Southern Africa. So we're expecting a number of additional countries from the African continent to be endorsing it and ratifying it soon. And we're hoping to have it finished in terms of its 50 ratifications by the end of this year. That's our goal.
Mm-hmm. So are you a lobbyist? Do you lobby these governments? Is that what your activities entail?
Yeah, I mean, they don't call them lobbyists, because I guess that's just not the word for it. But we're registered as a non-governmental organization at the United Nations and have been since 1990. So we...
You interface with people that work in and out of the UN and try to move this treaty forward and figure out what they need so that you can, or convince them of why this is an urgent matter.
Yeah, for me personally, I've been to Geneva to the last Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee meeting last year, and which was ICANN organized a campaigners meeting and then some lobbying of the different missions that were there participating in that treaty. And so I was involved in that, and then also when the UN went into formal session last fall, I participated in another ICANN effort to try and get countries to support the treaty. But most of the work really, at this point, we've convinced the diplomats that it's a good idea. Now we need to convince people in national capitals around the world that this is an important enough issue that they need to take time out of their other issues to look at it, deliberate on it, and join it. And so that's where the main challenge is. I think we have enough countries supporting it, but to get them to go through what they need to get the ratification done takes a little time.
Yeah. It's interesting. Did I hear you say that Japan resisted signing on to this?
Japan has not signed on to it. They didn't vote.
I mean, they're the only country on the planet, though, that's really been negatively impacted by nuclear war. And frankly, the accident in Fukushima is the worst accident that's ever occurred on the planet. And, they're the only country that's ever been attacked with a nuclear weapon. You'd think that their government would be firmly behind stopping anything that has to do with nuclear.
I think it's a really sticky issue for the Japanese because they're in a treaty alliance with the United States that includes them being protected by our nuclear weapons umbrella, with most recently North Korea now potentially a threat to Japan, and China having been a long-term threat, and Russia being a threat, I guess, to some extent as well. So they've been in this military alliance with the United States, and the United States interweaves all of its military strategy and doctrine with the threat of nuclear weapons. They're always
even nuclear energy. They even, they're building the military bases in the United States are building those small nuclear modular reactors. They're actually going up on nuclear bases, on the bases.
Not yet. They've talked about that yet, but that's not actually happening.
Well, I'd heard that they've actually passed it. Like they're planning. I mean, they're allocating funds for it. It's not like they've got it, but there is a site in Utah where they're definitely, from what I understand, they're definitely doing it.
I can tell you more about that if you're interested in it. If you want to sidetrack into that. Just one last thing I want to say about the treaty.
I'd really rather stick with this treaty thing because this is a huge issue, this treaty against nuclear weapons. Like, it is very shocking to me that governments don't just fully embrace it because everybody says we don't want to use nuclear weapons. So why is there not the logic of saying, no, we're not going to use nuclear weapons. We really understand that that's a catastrophic threat to the entire planet, but we don't want to sign on to the treaty. Right?
Yes, and the thing that was really weird in last year's nuclear posture review, which is what they call their analysis of their nuclear weapons policy, which they issue periodically. This is the United States. They established that they wanted to develop low-yield nuclear weapons as a threat to opponents, nuclear-armed opponents, and other opponents who aren't nuclear-armed, that we might use them in battlefield situations. And they justified it on the principle that if we have that threat there, then it's less likely we'll end up having to use them, because if all we had were these giant nuclear weapons, they would know we weren't going to use those. And then if they thought we have these smaller ones that are maybe a tenth the size of Hiroshima, that they might think we're going to use them, and then therefore will understand that they shouldn't cross our red lines. Well, that's really tortured logic by anyone's calculation. And
don't they consider depleted uranium weapons to be nuclear weapons?
No, they don't at all. Not in the slightest.
Wow. Aren't they nuclear?
They are.
They do have nuclear contaminants on them.
Definitely, yeah. And the United States government, and I think some other governments, pretty much still ignore that this has health effects, even though there have been enough studies at this point to show that they do.
Leon Panetta, when he was walking out the door of the Obama administration, alluded to the harm it's causing our own soldiers, that they have suffered.
The first Gulf War was even the worst because they didn't know, or well, aspects of the armed forces knew that depleted uranium was not something you wanted to inhale into your lungs, but they didn't bother to tell the soldiers that. And the soldiers were posing on tanks that had been destroyed by Warthog aircraft using depleted uranium rounds. All these tanks got destroyed when Saddam's army retreated back from Kuwait into Iraq, and then the troops just were trophy hunting, souvenir hunting, crawling around in these blown up tanks, and a bunch of them got contaminated with depleted uranium. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely a major factor in the Gulf War syndrome that people experienced.
Mm-hmm. So this treaty that you're working on, though, that excludes these depleted uranium weapons. That's your treaty that you're working to get ratified excludes excludes the depleted uranium. And those, in fact, are not even being...
It only deals with the fission and fusion weapons, which depleted uranium rounds are not that.
Right.
They're contaminants, but they don't cause fission or fusion to it.
So what's the status on this effort to get these countries? I mean, do you think that this is actually... do you foresee a time when the United States government can actually embrace a treaty like this and say, you know what, we're going to do this?
I really am not sure if that would be the way they would do it. I would say probably not. Our co-president, Ira Helfand, who's been working on these issues since he helped to revive with Caldecott PSR back in the 70s, he's convinced that it probably will be some other mechanism. And they've been promoting a program called Back from the Brink with the Union of Concerned Scientists. This is sort of a PSR Union of Concerned Scientists effort to get communities and elected officials to get behind a 5-point plan. The first 4 are, no first use of weapons, and several other sort of arms types of things that that we've been trying to get Congress and the president to do for some time. And the 5th is to negotiate with the other nuclear weapons states to abolish nuclear weapons, to have as our goal through negotiation and verification to get rid of them completely. And that's in there, but it would not necessarily be through the treaty. You could sign the treaty and then observe it, but more likely the United States would still want to negotiate with Russia primarily, but then if you're going to go to zero, you have to negotiate with everyone, the timing and all of the other details. So it probably would require another treaty for the nuclear weapon states to get out of it. But this puts pressure on them and stigmatizes the nuclear weapon just the same as chemical weapons and other illegal international weapons, and moves the ball forward, in our opinion. It's possible that some nuclear weapon states would sign it. There's nuclear weapon states like the United Kingdom, for example, which is becoming less and less of a relevant international power and might decide that it no longer wants to go to the expense and have the moral stigma of continuing to produce nuclear weapons and maintain them. And they're the most likely of the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons to be the first to get rid of them, in our opinion. So with the United States, though, I would have to say that most likely they might sign the treaty, but they wouldn't ratify it until they had figured out side agreements with all of the nuclear weapons states.
It makes me wonder, like, if is there any plan in place? I mean, do you know of any, you're involved in this, do you know of any organizations that are in place currently that in the event that one of these nations decides to go rogue and, like Pakistan, India, is there any plan to forewarn the people? Because I know one of the things that happens anytime any nuclear anything happens is governments keep their traps shut. They don't warn people at all about the harm that, like people think, oh, well, it's over there in India, it's Pakistan, it's never going to hurt us. It actually is going to hurt people if there's like a quote limited nuclear war over there, right?
Well, yeah, no, our government is downplaying. They don't ascribe to the nuclear winter scenario. They have their own sets of figures that they don't share with anyone. It's not like they're participating in a scientific debate, but they claim that our figures are incorrect and that.
But they're not telling you their figures. They're saying your numbers are bad, but we're not showing you ours that tells you that your numbers are bad.
Yeah, they're saying it isn't as bad as we're claiming that.
Wow.
Nuclear war would be a complete disaster. But.
Wow. They're so laissez-faire, not just with human life, but with all life on this planet. It's just incomprehensible to me. I honestly find it stunning. So, does that mean, like, Chuck, I'm very curious about your activities of the work, because your organization, to be honest, I'd never really heard of this organization, and after you went to work there, I started looking into it. It's been around for a good long while, right? So
yeah, it was founded in 1980.
How is it that we give these organizations that are really doing the behind-the-scenes work more? I mean, that's why I'm glad that I could have you on this show, but what are the kinds of things that we can do to highlight the work that your organization is doing? Because it is instrumental in maintaining world peace, it sounds like.
Well, if we can get medical professionals interested in joining either their PSR chapter, which would probably be the best thing they could do, because that's the best way that an American physician or nurse or other medical professional can get involved in these issues. That would probably be the best way. It's less important that they know, initially the name of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, but once you become a member of PSR, you're aware of our international arm. We were better known in the 80s because we had high-profile physicians who were going to the Soviet Union and speaking, and we had exchanges with Soviet physicians who came to the United States, and it was we were better known. We actually had a large office. I think it peaked around 1991 of around 30 people, and we're a reasonably high-profile group. Won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. But the end of the Cold War really brought an end in interest in nuclear weapons issues worldwide, and so our organization has struggled for the last few decades to keep people aware of the fact that we still have nuclear weapons and they're still an enormous existential threat. And it was this foundation of ICANN and the treaty was an effort to revive a worldwide anti-nuclear weapons movement, and I think it's been pretty successful. We won the Nobel Peace Prize. ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its work in establishing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and got us some publicity. Our executive director, Beatrice Finn, has been doing a lot of media work internationally and has become a recognized figure. Mm-hmm. IPPNW understood that it wasn't going to be able to, it didn't have the wherewithal at the time that we founded ICANN to promote this international treaty and broadened it out. And that's why, there are over 500 groups, including, I think, 25 or 30 in the United States that are part of ICANN. And so people want to join ICANN if they don't, if they're not medical professionals or they don't want to work through a medical organization. Just about any anti-nuclear weapons group. There are a few that aren't, but most of them are in some way affiliated with ICANN.
That's
but
true.
they're all doing work, and it's the kind of thing that you can find what suits you and what fits best for you, and then do your small part to put this issue back on the map in the United States.
It is completely off the map. Let me, what is the United States' position like? Why will they not sign on to this treaty? Why not?
Oh, well, I mean, this is under the Obama administration. This doesn't matter. It's been U.S. policy that mutually assured destruction and the nuclear deterrent are an essential part of our military defense. And that's just doctrine that's accepted by establishment Democrats and Republicans alike. So the Trump administration is a little more aggressive, but not that much different from the Obama administration. And then Trump himself is bizarre and more likely to do something strange, and therefore scarier than Obama as president. But both of them retain this power to use nuclear weapons without consulting anyone, and that's a frightening thing. The effort in the United States by a union of concerned scientists, particularly, and by this group called Global Zero, and Beyond the Bomb, which has formed local chapters in the United States, have been emphasizing this fact, and they're supporting legislation in Congress to eliminate first use, establish a no first use policy, something that nuclear arms control people had been trying to get President Obama to declare unsuccessfully. Unfortunately, he did not have the nerve to do it. He had advisors who were telling him not to do it.
I recently read that Trump basically signed something that said that they will definitely, who was it? Even Mike Pompeo was talking about this. The United States' stance now is we will be the first use. We will be the aggressor if you mess with us, or something to that point. Like they made it. I was watching some
That's what these low yield weapons are about, is having them be a tripwire. And if you cross a red line, we might use nuclear weapons on you. And it doesn't limit it just to nuclear weapon states either. And the United States has a long history, since the beginning of the nuclear weapons age, of threatening other countries with nuclear weapons. I think it's been documented that there's somewhere, 35 or 40 times the United States has threatened to use nuclear weapons when it has disputes internationally.
Wow.
So it's been a tool of our foreign policy.
Has it really? Wow. Wow. So they use it like a bludgeon to threaten people to make them cower.
Sure.
That's why they want to have 8. See, this has been my thinking.
Nothing off the table. That phrase that nothing is off the table.
Yeah.
When they were talking about when they were going to invade Saddam, or when they threaten other countries, that's one of the things that they never take off the table. And they want, and it's been U.S. policy to have that. It wasn't always Soviet or Russian policy. There were times when they established a no first use policy.
Well, the interesting thing is the number that they've agreed on, 1,800 weapons each, right? Like these mega powers. Like, why do they need 1,800? Like, isn't that a peculiar? I thought
16.
So why couldn't they just have like 10? Who needs more than 10 nuclear bombs? You know what I mean? Like, if you're going to have them after dropping 10 bombs, whoever your opponent is going to stop, right?
Well, not necessarily. If you only have 10, there are arms control experts who have spent entire careers trying to figure out what the number of nuclear weapons are for the sort of the minimal deterrent, and they sort of settled on what the Chinese have done. If you're going to buy into their theory of mutually assured destruction, and so you don't want to, you'll prevent their use by having a certain number, which is, it's strange on its face because it assumes that people will remain rational. But anyway, the Chinese have about 400 nuclear weapons, and they haven't built beyond that. They built up to 400 nuclear weapons, and they seem to be satisfied to be at that level. And they're like the third largest. They have the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. But the French and the British have something similar to that, just a few less. And so that's India and Pakistan seem to have settled in at around 150 each.
Wow.
So it's and it's not clear how many Israel has. There have been really wide estimates of it. It's the most secret of all of the nuclear weapons programs.
That's probably a topic for another show, another whole topic as to why Israel is allowed to tell us, basically give everybody the finger and say, we're not telling you anything. You know what I mean? Like, it's beyond comprehension that a nation state has been allowed to go so rogue, and yet the United States does nothing but pour money into it. I mean, to me, what it tells me is that the government of Israel is actually an extension of the industrial military complex. They're the secret government of the industrial military complex. So that's,
Well, they're very, very tied in with the U.S. It's true.
There's something going on there that most of us, we're on a need to know basis, and we don't need to know. So but that whole topic of how these, how we come to these numbers, the sad part is we're in it's kind of like that idea, if you build it, they will come, right? So like just having the weapons means they're going to be used at some point. This is not a one-off. It's going to happen. And so we have to really, this is why I admire the work you're doing, because it's a hard slog to get through this to people who basically have all the power. Like, you're going up against a steel wall and trying to chip away at it with a nub of a pencil eraser. We're going to get through. You know what I mean? It's a really big challenge. So
it is, but it's like so many big challenges. And some big challenges you think are impossible, and then all of a sudden there's a breakthrough.
Right.
You have
That's
a situation in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, of
That's right.
totally intractable, centuries of horrible feeling and periodic guerrilla fighting and just horrible bad blood, and yet things got bad enough that enough people who didn't want that to continue asserted their rights, and they had enough leadership internationally to help ease it and make it happen.
It's kind of like Germany, right, Chuck?
Claire some credit for this, for one of the few things he did that I like, especially in his later years. But they basically have this agreement. It's threatened by Brexit right now to some degree, but things can happen, and when we don't give our own power enough credit when we think that we can't change anything, because we can, and we have,
right,
and we have to.
Right.
The climate issue, you look at all of the people who've been mobilized on that, and they're fighting the international energy industry, and they're having a hard time. But there have been a lot of gains. Whether it's fast enough, that's another question. And that's also the question for us, because, we're starting to hem in the nuclear weapon states internationally with our treaty, our little treaty that nobody in the United States knows about.
I think most people assume that the United States has signed on to it. That's the interesting point, is that most Americans, I was stunned when I heard that they did not sign on to it, because,
well, no, let me just tell you, if you signed the treaty, you would have to get rid of your nuclear weapons. So there's no way the United States would sign on to that treaty right now.
Especially when they're thinking, they're implementing the weapons in space thing, like the whole Space Force thing is actually, that's the other part of this pie that they're not. The whole thing is based on secrecy. And I think that, a little small topic about Israel is really kind of highlights exactly how secretive the whole thing is and how dismissive it is to real scientific fact. Like, we're coming on 8 years of Fukushima having created the world's worst disaster. They're just now beginning to understand what really went on there. Like, they have just been, it's been a really, they're so over their head with this nuclear. And I think it's because of the war machine, frankly, Chuck. Like, they like the destructive aspect of it, so they have been able to redevelop and develop these nuclear weapons, and they're going for the bigger gusto and all this stuff. If they had implemented as much energy into how to denuclearize and how to create world peace, I mean, we could be way farther ahead on that.
We had a missed opportunity at the end of the Cold War, and I think a lot of people thought we were going to finish the job. Reagan and Gorbachev talked about going for total abolition in Reykjavik, and then Reagan backed away from it due to his advisors telling him that they didn't want him to do that. And George H.W. Bush unilaterally got rid of some weapons and then signed an agreement with, I'm not sure if it was still Gorbachev or if it had moved to Yeltsin at that point, but brought in additional new limit agreements, and things were heading in the right direction, and they kind of stalled out during the Clinton administration. And part of that was timidity on the part of the Clinton administration in terms of not wanting to look weak. And then there was this whole discussion over whether or not we should extend NATO all the way to the Russian border. Mm-hmm. And they went along with that, which felt very threatening to Russia. So that hurt our relationship with them. We also did not, in assisting the Yeltsin administration, we helped set up this entire system of oligarchs that they're now suffering under. We blew the end of the Cold War, basically. Instead of a Marshall Plan, we did what happened after World War I, basically. We punished the Russians. We kept box, and now a nationalistic leader is in charge of them, and who's not our friend. How warmly he and President Trump seem to feel about one another. So I think that's where it stalled out. And then the other thing was, this whole vision of Star Wars was always a big problem for the Russians, because if you set up an anti-ballistic missile system, it makes it harder for you to maintain mutually assured destruction. As long as your opponent has nuclear weapons and they set up a Star Wars system or a system that can block your weapons, then you have to have more. You have to have enough to be able to get through their defensive systems. That's why we had the anti-ballistic missile system that Nixon signed on to. We agreed we didn't want to have an arms race in defensive weapons. Well, Star Wars and the decision of the Reagan administration to pursue research into defensive weapons, and then when they began to, when they pulled out of the treaty, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration pulled out of the ABM treaty early in his administration and put out batteries of anti-ballistic missiles in Romania, allegedly to protect Europe from Iran, but situated in such a way that they could affect Russia. The Russians feel threatened, and they feel like the United States is trying to edge the game in its favor, and we're back into the arms race again.
Yeah, that's quite evident. It's really, this is such a big, gigantic topic. Chuck, I want to thank you for coming on my radio show. I hope that you'll come back. We're at the end of the hour. We have just a couple minutes left, but this is a very deep and pertinent conversation that most Americans really do need to know about, because your efforts really will help circumvent most Americans, especially now. I think many Americans are really, we have this threat of nuclear war on a trigger hanging over us as long as the traitor is in the White House, because when his kids get in, this is my feeling. I have this anxiety that when his kids get indicted, he's going to ask, someone to lob a bomb near us as a distraction. So I hope that you will come back and we can further explore all of these ideas.
Absolutely, and I want to come back on and talk about these small modular reactors you're talking about in Idaho, because that is a real threat. They aren't building them yet. They claim they're going to have them finished by 2026. Probably won't, but in their first group of these reactors in Idaho. But I'd love to come on your show and talk about that as well.
I'd love that. Well, thank you, Chuck, for joining us. And thank everybody for listening to us. You have been listening to Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show with my guest, Mr. Chuck Johnson, who's the director of nuclear programs for the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Is it nuclear war?
Correct.
Or nuclear war? Yeah. And and it's you can find them at www.IPPNW.org. That's I, P as in Paul, P as in Paul, N as in Nancy, W.org. So we really appreciate you tuning in, and thank you, Chuck, for joining us.
It was great to be on your show, and I look forward to being on it next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Put your courage feet on, you guys.
8 minutes to remember the past 65 years. That's how long this nuclear nightmare has been going on, and our question remains the same. When will it end? Hey y'all, it's Dave here from Operation Save the Earth, and this is the Fuuka Friday Happy Hour Hangout for March 1st, 2019. Today is Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, but it should be a global holiday, bigger than National Pizza Day or whatever, because nuclear testing and the aftermath of that testing is something that has had a long-lasting and profound effect on all of us. On March 1st, 1954, the largest thermonuclear detonation in U.S. nuke testing history, called Castle Bravo, took place at Bikini Atoll in the Marshalls, and the fallout from that explosion are still being felt to this day in the region. The makers of the bomb miscalculated on the yield of the radioactive fallout to the tune of 3 times over what was planned, resulting in a 15 megaton blast that was roughly 1,000 times greater than those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Critical fallout from the device fell on servicemen associated with Operation Castle, as well as Marshallese residents of Rongelap, Rongerik, Alingina, and Ultrik atolls, some of whom had no idea a nuclear test had taken place since nobody told them about it or how to safeguard themselves from the after effects. Kids in Rongelap thought the fallout ash was like snow, so they started playing in it and eating it. Needless to say, the health consequences have been dire for residents ever since. This explosion also caused a death due to overexposure on the infamous Lucky Dragon No. 5 fishing boat from Japan, causing a rift between Japan and the U.S. and sparking the inspiration of one of the biggest anti-nuke icons in world history, Godzilla. After the mistake that was Castle Bravo and the fallout spread all around the world, it should have marked the end of nuclear testing forever, but was in reality just the beginning of hundreds more tests to come, each time exposing us to more and more radiation. Eventually, treaties were signed to keep nukes underground for testing or banned outright in some countries, but Pandora's box had already been opened, and we've been paying for it ever since. There are lots of videos and articles about Castle Bravo you can check out for yourself online. See the links below. And I encourage you to do so because if you don't know your history, you are doomed to repeat it. And haven't we had enough? I mean, I hear the argument all the time. The fallout isn't that bad. You probably won't die of cancer or blah, blah, blah. And I mean, is that all you really have to say, bad guys? Have you talked to Marshallese grandma lately? If nuclear fallout is so nice, why don't you guys move to Ground Zero where the explosion took place? We need nuclear weapons again for what? Exactly. to make big booms that make the higher-ups go ooh and ah over. No, for them to profit from while the rest of us suffer. Cancer comes from nuclear. When are people going to get that? When everyone has it? When everyone is born with it? Miracle cures are still on chalkboards at this point, and people are dying today, right now, because of what we've done to ourselves. Well, the Fuuka fighters are saying enough is enough. Why anyone would want to blow up this big, beautiful world with all of its amazing diversity and gorgeousness is beyond me, especially since my generation has figured out a way to do that in a virtual space without actually hurting anyone. I mean, really, bad guys, you don't have a PlayStation or Xbox. You can kill each other all day on that if you want, instead of ruining the real world space that we have to share. Duh. But maybe they just need more education, right, gang? See, we can help with that. If you haven't already, Fuuka Fighters, point your local bad guy to our website at OperationSaveTheEarth.com so that they can begin their journey and understand more about the Fukushima problem, about the nuclear problem, about everything that you need to know about what's going on with nukes all day long, because that's where it is, all right? And then, when you're ready to share more with them, be sure to have them sign up for our free weekly newsletter. All you gotta do is have them send me an email at info@OperationSaveTheEarth.com, and I will put them on the mailing list, and then they can learn for themselves, all right? Also, don't forget, we have a Twitter handle that's at OSTE8Minutes that everyone can follow and get the latest Fukushima news of the week right there. Now, for the Marshallese, Caso Bravo happened yesterday, and it'll happen again for them tomorrow as one by one, the old ones die away. How about this? Stop treating indigenous people as less than. Let's start treating everyone fairly and with the respect due them. Say no to nukes in all its forms, because history shows us in the long run, nobody wins when they're used in any capacity. So until next remembrance, this is Dave saying peace and good fortune to everyone.
Thank you for joining the Age of Vision radio show. Please like, subscribe, and share on Spreaker.com or on the YouTube channel Nutzforart, NUTZFORART. Send all comments and ideas to Lonnie Clark at ageofvision@gmail.com. We urge all, especially scientists and politicians, to follow the words of our beloved American icon, Mark Twain. Always do right. This will gratify some and astonish the rest.